Total whiteout in China. Smog shuts down a city of 11 million people in the northeast of the country. Yet another victim of dramatic growth and pollution. But what's the government doing about it? And what are the consequences for people and their health? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. It is getting colder in China. That means more people are switching on their heating systems and driving to work. The impact, a deadly smog. This time it has shut down a city of 11 million people. Harbin, the largest city in the northeastern province of Heilongjiang, has closed its schools and airport in the country's first major air pollution crisis of the winter. The Chinese government has in the past announced plans to tackle pollution problems, but has made little progress. Other parts in that region have also experienced severe smog, including Tangshan, 2 hours east of Beijing, and Changchun, the capital of Jilin province, which borders Heilongjiang. The World Bank estimates 16 of the world's 20 most polluted cities are in China. Scientists measure pollution using a system called a particulate measure. The World Health Organization recommends a daily level of no more than 20, but some parts of Harbin have reached levels of 1,000. Levels this high are primarily responsible for causing lung cancer and asthma. For more on this, I'm joined by our three guests. From Hong Kong, Andrew Leung, an independent China analyst and economist. From Beijing, Huang Wei, climate and energy campaigner for Greenpeace. And joining us here in Doha, Kurt Straif, head of monographs at the Cancer Research Unit for the World Health Organization. Huang, describe what you're hearing is happening in Harbin City. How bad is the smog there?
Well, according to the data, yesterday the PM2.5 index level of Harbin has reached to the monitoring. That means like the machine cannot read the index anymore. That's about 500 per cubic meter, microgram per cubic meter.
Extraordinary. Describe to us what this sort of, what's been described as a whiteout looks like. I mean, how far can you see? We know that it's preventing planes from landing at airports.
Well, actually, the two direct causes for the smog right now in Harbin, one is the weather condition. That means because of the humidity is quite high, that's caused the drop of the visibility. And then the second cause is because the city started their heating system yesterday, and that's also when this epic smog started to happen. So as we can see that actually when the visibility dropped to less than 10 meters, that's what we heard from the news in Harbin right now. That means the pollution level is quite high right now.
I should imagine it must be pretty frightening being there.
Yes.
Kurt, I know that you've been to the area, I gather from the 80s, and that it's always been bad. Tell us what your experience was, what you saw, and the sort of impact it's having on people physically.
Well, that was about 30 years ago, and there was on a travel and just passed through Harbin, and that was just a personal impression at the time, not as a scientist measuring the exposure levels. But we know from what we have reviewed now with our monograph that indeed the exposure levels are highest in some parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, etc., and particularly in ports where there is heavy industrialization and rapid development.
And this is an area that has just that. Tell us what the impact is on the body, how it affects you, how it affects your lungs.
Well, let me be clear. What we did is not one single additional study. In fact, we convened the world's leading expert on that topic in our IARC monographs program. IARC, that is a specialized cancer research agency of the World Health Organization. And we run this program since 40 years now to really look into what's causing cancer in humans. And this recent topic was on air pollution in general, and therefore we convened the world's leading experts on that topic to come up with a consensus evaluation of whatever has been published on that topic. So this is about cancer in humans, about cancer in experimental studies, but also all the other toxicological studies that contribute to this understanding. And the unanimous conclusion of these leading experts really was, yes, we can say that air pollution causes cancer in humans, and it's particularly lung cancer that is being caused by this type of air pollution.
So it could kill you if you just breathe?
That's the way you can say it, yes.
Andrew, what sort of impact is this having on the economy, say on that region, for example, where you've got half of the industry closed down, the airports closed down, and obviously the sort of impact it's having on people's health and the fact that they can't work, some of them?
Well, of course, any shutdown would have a tremendous impact on the economy, whether in China or elsewhere. But I think it's not just the economy, it's not just the health, it's the existential threat to the stability of the government, or indeed of the Communist Party. Because it's not just air pollution, it's water pollution, and also it's soil pollution. Almost 100 years of industrialization has been compressed in about 30 years. So the situation is now reminiscent of the dark days of Victoria, England. The reference to dark satanic mills is very much alive nowadays in many cities, not just Harbin. I mean, for example, in Beijing, in Shanghai, and I just came back from Xi'an. All the cities are shrouded in smog.
I mean, people are talking
so
about it as an
air
apocalypse. I mean, that seems to be quite a good description, doesn't it?
Well, the PM 2.5 is a measure, and indeed the Chinese government has recently mandated that cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou would have to reduce the PM 2.5 by 25%, 20% and 15% respectively by 2017. And nowadays, unlike previous decades, where party secretaries could deliver just on the economy, nowadays they are held to account on pollution, on sustainability, and of course to maintaining a kind of harmonious society, because there is a lot of the unrests are sparked by concern about pollution, not just air pollution, but water pollution, because the industries, although there are regulations, but there are huge violations. So I think that the government is now getting very, very serious. As I said, it's an existential threat to the stability of the government.
Huang, tell us about this plan you were nodding there to cut the usage of coal, to bring down these extraordinary levels, and the sort of conversations that you're having with the government regarding this.
Well, first I have to second what Andrew said. Actually, the problem, the cause that why China have this massive smog in these cities are not only because, for instance, take Harbin for example, it's not only because that Harbin started their heating system yesterday. If we look at the index, actually from last Friday, Harbin is having really bad air quality too. The index, the reading is also above 400. And if we take for a longer time span, that like Beijing, most of the cities in China are below, cannot achieve the national standard. But unlike Beijing, most of the cities in China doesn't have emergency plan tackling air pollution, and most of the cities doesn't have long-term plan of resolving the problem. And as we know that in September 12th, the State Council issued the National Air Pollution Control Action Plan, aiming to reduce the air pollution, PM 2.5 pollution in the 3 key regions. And not only giving a specific number of the reduction target, the national plan also mentioned that for the key regions of Tianjin, Hebei, Beijing, Hebei area, and the Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta, try to achieve a negative coal consumption increase in the coming 5 years. That means actually the government knows that the true root of the air pollution problem is the coal consumption, the massive coal consumption in China right now. But unlike the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei area, we don't see that right now in the northeast part of China is implementing any kind of this coal consumption reduction target. This will be a bigger problem, and this will make the air pollution even harder to be cleaned up if the north part of China doesn't take any actions to curb its coal consumption.
Kurt, do you, as a medical man, I mean, is it a combination of coal? Is it what's coming out of the back of the car and from industry that's having a combined cumulative effect?
Well, indeed, we have previously looked at specific chemical exposures in the air or in the workplace and have classified some of these of known to cause cancer in humans, like a specific chemical that results also from incomplete combustion of fossil fuels that is called benzoapyrene. And then we have looked at some specific mixtures, as I mentioned before, like from burning coal for indoor heating or cooking, or from diesel engine exhaust. And all of these mix up to this kind of mixture of air pollution that is, depending on the local sources and their contribution, very different across the world. But our conclusion and the experts' conclusion was that this kind of mixture, this air pollution, is generally causing cancer in humans. And it's often measured in one way with this particulate matter that is very small. It's less than 2.5 micrometer. This is just a technical way of measuring air pollution. There's other ways of measuring air pollution. But this way of measuring was also one of the approaches that was used for the evaluation of all the literature. So in fact, the experts came up with a second independent evaluation that also the particulate matter specifically in the outdoor air pollution is causing cancer, and specifically lung cancer in these exposed populations.
Okay, so obviously, I mean, pollution is having a major effect on China and many parts of China, actually. The most worrying impact is clearly on people's health. Air pollution has cut life expectancy by an average of 5.5 years in the north, and it's causing higher rates of lung cancer, strokes and heart attacks. It's also affecting people's day-to-day lives. As we heard earlier, it's closed down airports and schools and halted construction and factory production. Pollution is also having a political effect. Media stories about Chinese officials using expensive air purifiers have only added to intense criticism of the government for not acting fast enough. I know you touched on this, Andrew, but where is this leaving the government? Because for many people, it seems that the government just, quite frankly, doesn't care.
Well, the problem is now so huge that any kind of genuine and very stringent measures are unlikely to act as a magic wand to change the situation, in months or even in a couple of years. But I think that there is a genuine now a sea change in the kind of concern in the government and all the way down the ranks. As I said, party secretaries are now held to account not just on the GDP growth, but on the pollution. But if you look at the scientific level, China's Academy of Sciences in their latest 2010 report publishes a roadmap to 2050 with kind of midterm targets, reducing, for example, fossil fuel from something like over 90% now to 80% by the year 2020, and eventually the ultimate target is 45% of total energy consumption by 2050. And then renewables is to grow from less than 10% now to 16% by year 2020, and again equal to coal at 45% by the year 2050. And then with nuclear power playing a more important role, rising eventually to 10% of total energy consumption by the year 2050. Now, this is a long way to go, and of course it's not a smooth ride, but I think that all the way through the fabric of the government, everybody's concerned, everybody's working on it, but the problem is so huge. It's not just about factories, it's also about the growth of cars. Now there are more private cars sold in China than the United States. and yet the percentage of car ownership is still very, very low. So there's a long way to go. In spite
the
of the
problem
fact
is,
that,
for example, Andrew, would you get out your car and get onto a bike knowing how dirty the air is?
Well, I mean, it's not a one-sided picture. In spite of the cars, of course, China is growing public transport. For example, heavy subsidies to encourage people to go by buses, and there will be more high-speed rail, for example, which is, of course, much better than driving cars from city to city. And there are also a huge expansion of underground railway. But as I was saying, the problem is now so huge that no matter how much you do, the problem is unlikely to change in the medium term. In the short term. But I think that hopefully the societies are all seize upon this problem, and the party leadership and all the officials down the rank are increasingly being held to account.
No, as Andrew is saying, the government is being forced to tackle pollution. The worst of it stems from China's dependence on coal. It's hoped the use of coal will peak by 2020 or possibly even earlier. Beijing's city government, for example, plans to reduce coal consumption by closing down 4 coal-fired power plants before 2015. Beijing also wants to reduce car emissions, which make up more than 22% of the city's air particles. And in a nationwide scheme, the government is offering a total of $818 million to regions that make the greatest improvements in reducing pollution. Kurt, it's the fact that the government needs to get better oversight, not just when it comes to polluting the air, but polluting water. I mean, for example, we had a horrible situation earlier this year when it was discovered that rotting pig carcasses were in a river that supplies Shanghai's water. I mean, that sort of combination of rotten air, rotten water, that could be deadly too.
No, certainly, but from my perspective, we're coming from a cancer research agency of the World Health Organization, so our focus is on cancer, which is only one of the outcomes of this heavy air pollution. As you mentioned before, there is also respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, which are altogether in numbers even more important than the cancers. But let me come back to the cancer link. I mean, we have talked about some exposure levels where Huang mentioned it's up to 500. And these are clearly peak exposures. But what, for example, WHO currently recommends is a peak exposure limit up to 50, which is 1/10 of the what has been measured in Harbin, whereas the average annual level should be around 20 or even below 20 micrograms per cubic meter. So there is really a very long way to go to reduce that. If you just, what you heard before, reducing by 20%, you're still at 400. And just to make that very clear, we looked at all the recent studies also published, and these were 2012, 2013, and these latest studies really also pointed towards increased risk of lung cancer at levels well below, even at levels below the current guideline standards for exposure. So we found an increase of lung cancer per every 10 microgram per cubic meter of PM2.5, meaning that even in the cleaner cities in, say, Western countries, in the US, in Europe, there is an increased risk of lung cancer resulting from that exposure. Just certainly, to put it in perspective, and what kind of efforts are needed to reduce this risk.
Huang, with all of that in mind, I mean, clearly something needs to be done and something needs to be done soon, but how do you get that balance of economic development, alleviating people, bringing people out of poverty, while at the same time curbing the impact that it's having on the environment?
Well, we think many of the environmental issues right now in China has reached as that Chinese government have to react and have to react fast. And if we consider about the air pollution problem, for example, we think the ultimate solution for this problem is to tackle the coal consumption. And that is that would be a very hard choice for the government in this because right now China relies really heavily on coal.
And
but
it's wonderfully cheap
compared
to other sources.
China is the biggest investor. Yes. But also we can see that China has huge potential in renewable energies for like solar and wind. And investing in these two domains could bring China not also the less environmental damage, but also to bring more opportunities. And we think that this is the time for the government to actually balance from the old traditional way of developing this economy, or trying to shift from this heavy industrial-driven economy structure to a much cleaner and much better economic structure.
Yeah, Andrew, clearly the country needs to rebalance the economy towards some sort of sustainable growth. I mean, is there a model out there that China is looking to?
Well, now, over the next few decades, China's economy will be driven by huge urbanization. In fact, China is seeing the world's largest urbanization drive in human history, the largest and fastest, because China is building 221 new cities, each with a population over 1 million, compared with only 35 of such cities in the entire Europe. You can just see the massive urbanization that's going on. And then, of course, if the cities are not built properly, people will travel long distances to work, they take their cars, and then, of course, how do you get the energy to drive urbanization? And power, if it is dependent on coal, that causes a lot of pollution. So I think that building more smart cities, borrowing best practices around the world, so that people are positioned in various areas. They don't have to travel long distances to work, cutting down on the kind of energy-intensive industries. Now, that would be a way forward. But you mentioned water pollution. That's also a very, very serious problem, because China doesn't only suffer water pollution, but there was a lack of water. And then added to the pollution of water and also underground water is a serious threat to human health, as well as to the sustainability of the economy.
Huang, if China doesn't do something very soon, I mean, what is your prognosis on China and the broader global impact and global warming?
Well, as I have mentioned, that the central government has issued an action plan to urge the key three regions to reduce to achieve the negative coal consumption increase. And meanwhile, just several days later, the China's Minister of Environmental Protection released this Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei area plus Shanxi province and Inner Mongolia and Shandong province to reduce the coal consumption. From the coal reduction target from Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei, and Shandong province add up to 83 million tons. This is a huge number, and also this is the historical moment for China actually for the first time to reduce its coal consumption in the key areas. And we know that as Shandong is the #1 coal consumer in China, this brings a very significant impact to the to the carbon emissions only from emitting from these provinces. And as we can see that this kind of determination from the central government to tackle the air pollution shows that they really take concern of the public health. And what we are expecting is more these kind of coal reduction targets being announced by similar provinces. For instance, like Jiangsu province also have severe air pollution problem, and Shanghai, and also the Pearl River Delta. And we hope that this kind of determination can expand to other provinces and more targets can be announced. And of course, that will bring much more positive signs to the climate change.
Kurt, what do you see in 10 years' time if China doesn't address this issue, and quickly? I mean, how sick will China be?
Well, indeed, this is a bit difficult to predict because, again, to put it in perspective, most of these studies that have shown the risk increase in lung cancer were from Western countries where the exposure levels were much lower. So we're a little bit reluctant in making extrapolations into these very high levels of exposure, but it's fair to say that we have observed higher risks in those higher exposed, even at exposure levels that were in the order of of 10 to 30 micrograms per cubic meter. That is less than 1/10 in what has currently been observed as a peak in Harbin. So to extrapolate to these high levels has many uncertainties, but the burden of cancer, lung cancer particularly related to this exposure, is certainly high.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andrew Leung, Huang Wei and Kurt Straif. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want, please do send us your feedback. Just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching.